Welcome to the Sanity interview by the New York Sun. Every week, along with my co-host Rebecca Sugar, we speak to the people that you want to hear from.
We're joined today by Senator James Lankford. The senator was elected to the United States Senate in 2014. He represents the state of Oklahoma, sits on several committees, including the Committee on Ethics, the Finance Committee, the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, the Committee on Intelligence. For 20 years prior to joining the Senate, Senator Lankford was serving in ministry, including running the Falls Creek Youth Camp. It's the largest youth camp in the United States. I couldn't believe when I read it was 51,000 campers. Is
Wow.
that right? That's a lot of campers.
Extraordinary.
So if you can handle that, I think you can handle the Senate. And he's also the author of a book which was published in April of this past year called Turnaround, America's Revival. I think it's a good read considering we're now going to celebrate the 250th birthday of America. And so all the faith and values and good ideas that you put into the book, I think we can all think about as we're celebrating this country. So thank you very much for being here.
You bet. Glad to be able to do it. Good to be able to join you.
I wanted to start today just on the topic of immigration. You, of course, were very much involved in a bipartisan bill which did not pass during the Biden administration, which addressed what was then very much an open border. And there were a lot of great things in the bill, including more funding for border agents and more wall construction and lots of things that would have been very helpful. It didn't pass, and now today here we are, and we have effectively a closed border. So I want to ask you the hindsight question. In hindsight, are you happy that the bill did not pass then? And are you happy with where our immigration policy is today? And then the last question is, going forward, do you think that some of the accomplishments of this Trump administration via EO will be legislated on so that we can count on them for the future?
Yeah, great question. I love the start of the podcast to say, let's just dive into your largest epic public failure.
Right. We can only go up from here.
And we'll just take off from there. So that was a 4-month process to try to be able to find out, how do we stop the hemorrhaging that was at our border? We had seen 2.5 million people illegally cross our border 2 years in a row, and it just was not getting better. And so I was looking for an opportunity to say, how do we make it stop? Everyone knows there are gaps in our law. Our asylum law has real problems with loopholes in it. Even President Trump in his first term was asking for changes in statute. There are some folks in the House of Representatives that are now raising the bill that they had in the House that was a partisan bill to say, hey, can we try to move this again? Because everyone sees some of the actions that are happening right now, the administration, to be able to secure our border. Courts are going to step in eventually and say, hey, we'll allow you to go this far, but we won't allow you to go that far. And the cartels will begin to exploit those weaknesses and those gaps in the law. So regardless of how many executive orders you put in place, we have to be able to fix the law. So for me, looking back at this a year and a half ago now, I would have still done the same thing. We still have the same gaps in the law. My focus was, how do I make it stop? We had another 1 million people illegally cross our border from the time that bill failed until President Trump came into office. So we have another 1 million people in the country that have to go through removal processes and all of the secondary effects that will occur because of that. So no, I think it's the right thing to do. I'm a legislator. My job in that role is to do what I can to fix the problems right now. And so I was focused on that. But you're right. The bill had additional border wall funding. We now have that border wall funding. We were able to do that in the One Big Beautiful Bill to add it. It added additional agents. We just added agents in the One Big Beautiful Bill. It added detention space. That was one of the other areas that we were doing, was adding detention space. So literally 3 of the aspects that were in my bill, we have now moved into the One Big Beautiful Bill and be able to make law. What we haven't done yet is close the loopholes and change the structure of how we handle asylum. That's still sitting out there. And I think regardless of who the president is, we're going to have to be able to get that resolved in the days ahead.
Senator, I think your point is well taken that the flurry of executive orders issued by President Trump are vulnerable on 2 fronts, right? One is, a Democratic president could just reverse them, and 2 is in the courts. Right, and we're already starting to see some of that. The administration's record at the Supreme Court is pretty good so far, but for example, on asylum, the administration had a setback in a district court, and we'll see what happens there. So, I think your point is really well taken. That sort of the ultimate solution is bipartisan immigration reform. So, do you see any hints that is still on the table? Obviously, there was the effort you led a year and a half ago, but are there even embers of that still burning?
Yes, there's still conversations that are happening, but each season and each time period with the president, the House, and the Senate, it will be a little bit different. The bill that I was working on was working with a Democrat Senate and a Democrat president and a Republican House. That's not what we have right now. So we will have a very different bill to be able to push through a set of ideas with Republicans in leadership and all of those. But as you know, in the Senate, you have to have 60 votes to be able to move a set of ideas. So it has to be a bipartisan proposal. There are some of the folks that are in my tribe as a Republican that would say, we've got all Republicans, do it all Republicans. And I just smile at them and say, that's not how it works in the United States of America. In the Senate, if you're creating policy, it will always have to be bipartisan. That means you got to sit down like a grown up, sit down with people you may disagree with on some issues, talk those things out, find the common ground, solve as many things as you can, and know there's some things unresolved. But two big issues there that really come up. But one of them I already mentioned, and you're right, district courts have already ruled and said the administration has to honor more with asylum. That is the law in the United States, and I think that will continue to be able to move up through the process. There's some things the president will do, like the Remain in Mexico policy, to say, yes, you can request asylum, but you can't be released into the United States to be able to await that. I think that's entirely appropriate to say there is nothing within our law that requires you can go anywhere in the country you want to go while you await a hearing on this. We can detain folks. We can have them wait in Mexico. We can do some of those things. That will help, but there will be challenges. The second one is actually for unaccompanied minors. The way our law is written right now, if there's an unaccompanied minor that comes from Mexico or from Canada, we can turn them around and return them to their parents back in those home countries immediately. But if they're coming from anywhere else other than Canada or Mexico, we keep that child, even if their parents are in another country. If an American child was being held by Honduras saying we're going to keep them, we would protest that. And I've literally had leaders in other countries say to me, give us our kids back. So there is a really interesting mix here of our law. It was originally written years ago to say we're going to try to stop child trafficking. What it has become is actually what has led to child trafficking, because once that child crosses the border, they're pushed into the United States. We saw this by the tens of thousands under the Biden administration, that they've lost track of those kids and don't know where they are because they only track them for 30 days. We've got to fix this issue about children crossing our border unaccompanied, and to make sure that we're returning back to their families, not keeping them and they get lost somewhere in the system here.
Let me just quickly follow up on that. I think, a lot of Americans would agree that the closing of the southern border, the tightening of the southern border is very much in the national interest. I think the Trump administration's policies towards deportation of people already here are far more polarizing. And I think you're seeing that in a lot of the poll numbers around immigration. Is there anything you'd be doing differently than the administration? Do you think it's picked the right fights? Do you think it's gone about deportations the right way? Or would you differ or sort of handle things otherwise?
So everyone's opposed to illegal immigration unless you go to church with them, or unless they work with you, or unless they're a neighbor across the street and you know them, and something like, well, I don't like illegal immigration, but I really like them. And so that's the difference here when you start talking about deportation. So where the Trump administration began was, we're going to deport the worst first. That was their main focus, to say, if this is a criminal alien, if they've got sex trafficking charges, if they have rape charges, if they have domestic abuse, if they have DUIs, we're going to remove those folks. And they've been very aggressive. But the difference that they've had in this is, contrary to previous administrations, ICE would move in, arrest that person, and ignore everyone else there. The Trump administration has said, if you have a criminal alien working in a location, you need to get them removed right away or expose them, because if we go in with ICE, arrest that criminal alien, we're going to ask everyone else there their immigration status. And if they're not legal, they will also be removed at the same time. That is different than previous administrations. It's not wrong. The Trump administration is still following the law that has always been appropriate to be able to do that. But the push has been we're going to remove criminal aliens. So if you're harboring someone, you know someone's in your workplace or in your family or lives in your home with you that is a criminal alien, know that that's putting every other person that's there also at risk. And so that's been a pretty big shift. And I understand it's been polarizing to some people, but it's fully within the law. The next step for us is to be able to determine if we've removed all criminal aliens, if we have a secure border that we have, like what we have right now, which is exceptionally secure border to be able to manage, we're able to make sure that we've closed the loopholes in the law to be able to make sure it stays secure. The next question is for folks that have been here 25 years, they've followed American law, they've been paying taxes all that time, but they're not legal. What's the next step? I think the administration will have that conversation, but it's a couple of years from now. Their main focus now is secure the border. Now, one caveat on that, the president in his very first interview as president, sitting down with Kristen Welker, when he sat down with her, the conversation about DACA came up, and the president was very outspoken to say, I want to give them citizenship. I think they should be able to have citizenship. Well, that takes an act of Congress to do that, but it was the first moment under this president for him to be able to put out there I want people to have access to citizenship of that particular group. The vast majority of other folks that may have access to staying here wouldn't have access to citizenship. They may have access to some kind of work permit, but not citizenship. That becomes the most polarizing issue. American citizenship is the greatest thing you can have on earth. If you begin that with an illegal act, there are a lot of people that are very offended by that. But if you have people here that are minding their P's and Q's, as my mom would say, but they're not pursuing citizenship, they're pursuing the ability to stay and work here, that's a very different issue.
Okay, I feel obligated since I started with what you called a failure to now move to what you're calling a success, which is the BBB, which you mentioned, the big, beautiful bill. There are a number of issues there to talk about. You could start really wherever you want, but I'd love for you to focus on some specific issues that I know you were very actively involved in putting into the bill. Things that have to do with farms, things that have to do with tax savings for seniors, all sorts of things that I think some people might view as small, but they have high impact, very large impact on individuals. And then maybe we can talk about some of the criticisms of the BBB that you want to defend against, things like the SNAP program or effects to Medicaid and things like that.
Yeah, let me break those up. Thanks for doing that. It's called the One Big Beautiful Bill for a reason, because it is big. It was about 940 pages. It was out for weeks, so people had plenty of time to be able to review it and to be able to go through it and to be able to talk about it. There were lots of last minute tweaks at the end as there was lots of conversation because everybody could read it and go through it and review it. But here are a couple of things that I think people might have missed. It did include about half the farm bill. We've not been able to get a farm bill. Our farmers and ranchers around the country are exceptionally vulnerable right now because a lot of things have changed since the last farm bill, and they desperately need engagement. About half the farm bill was included in this bill, so that's very significant. We're modernizing air traffic control, which a lot of people have said, hey, we see we've got 1960s era technology that's there. We've got to be able to revamp this nationwide. This starts that process, $12.5 billion to be able to make the modernizations that are needed nationwide on air traffic control. That's in this bill. We have border security, as we mentioned before, detention facilities, border agents, border wall area, but shifts in how we're actually managing the border long-term happen in this bill. We have modernization for our military in this bill, a lot of shipbuilding, other things that we're very far behind on had to be resolved and are resolved in this bill. But then it's the tax policy, and I serve on the finance committee that really has the largest amount of focus in the bill. We get in the tax policy, a couple of big things. One is it keeps the tax rates from expiring. There's all this talk on the left about this was all about billionaires and millionaires. That's ridiculous. No, it's not. Every single tax rate was just held the same. So every single tax rate was scheduled to go up. Now every single tax rate stays the same. The targeted tax relief that's built into the bill was really built into key areas that we thought there's a need to be able to deal with this. So let me give you some. And all of these I worked on because I serve on the finance committee. For businesses that do manufacturing or any small businesses out there, they will say the most significant tax relief that they can have is they don't have to depreciate big capital expenses over multiple years. They can do it all at once. It's called full expensing. I fought for that from the beginning for years, actually, to be able to make sure in the next tax bill we could get it. We got that, and it's permanent new tax policy. If a company is buying a new piece of equipment, if they're buying a new truck, if they're buying a new tractor on a farm or ranch, they're able to depreciate that year and do full expensing for it. That means they don't have to, when they have a big purchase year, they don't have to get a loan to pay their taxes to be able to spread it out over several years. They can write that off in the year they actually purchased it. That is exceptionally important economic policy. We also did the research and development. China is kicking our tail on this, on how they're handling research and development. We have been lagging behind on this. We fixed that for our companies that do research and development to make sure they can write off those expenses, and that's permanent policy. Interest deductions, that's new permanent policy to make sure that was built in. Very important to our businesses. But for seniors that are working seniors, and we have a lot of working seniors, we actually increase what's called the standard deduction for them to make sure working seniors, they pay less in taxes. They are in a more fixed income. They're at a critical time to be able to make sure they're watching their assets and what they're doing during that time period and saving up. So we made sure we gave the maximum amount of tax relief to lower income working seniors. So that was a main target area. For people that do overtime, like our cops and firefighters and all of our law enforcement, they do a lot of overtime. They won't have tax on their overtime anymore. That will help them directly. For folks that are service employees, that are Uber, that are wait staff in restaurants and such, they can write off their tip income and not be able to have that. That's significant. But let me give you a couple others. I worked a lot on the nonprofit sector. That's an area that, as you mentioned before, that I came out of before. In the 2017 tax bill, we changed the law that only those that itemize their taxes can write off their nonprofit donations. Non-itemizers cannot. That means 91% of Americans can no longer write off their nonprofit donations. Well, I think that's wrong. And so for years, I've been working to be able to make sure that we can get this right. So as of next year, a family can write up to $2,000 of their nonprofit donations. Even if they don't itemize their taxes, they can still write off $2,000 of their nonprofit donations. That incentivizes every family in the country to be able to do more, to be able to help local nonprofits. Those are the folks that are actually feeding the hungry and taking care of the homeless, and those that are hurting are those nonprofits in those local areas, and we want to incentivize more engagement. One last thing, then I want to get into some of the other stuff on it, but the energy side of things became a lot of debate on this. I serve in an energy state, Oklahoma, that is truly an all of the above energy state. Our electricity, 45% of it is done by wind power. We have a lot of solar, a lot of hydro, a lot of wind power. We also do oil, gas, and coal. We're all of it. But during the 2021 time period, when Democrats had control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, they created a new tax on oil and gas production called the intangible drilling costs. That big tax piece they created basically said if you manufacture anything, you can write off your expenses unless you're oil and gas. If you're oil and gas, you can't write your expenses off. What that meant is fewer wells being drilled and fewer opportunities for domestic energy. So one of the things I fought for and was able to win in this was to be able to take that punitive tax off oil and gas and say treat oil and gas the same as any other manufacturer. So whether you're making a widget or whether you're making a barrel of oil, you should be treated the same in our tax policy. And now we finally are again. So there are literally 940 pages of lots of good ideas to be able to help our economy. But I want to be able to hit some of the highlights on those.
So can I just follow up and ask the obvious question? The criticism of the BBB, of course, is that it raises the deficit. After everything we went through with DOGE, how could Congress pass a bill that actually raises the deficit? To which you would say?
I would say if you look at the final Congressional Budget Office score, they're the nonpartisan scorekeeper. The final score they put out when the bill was finally finished, passed, signed, and done, they do a wrap up of it. They said the bill reduces our deficit by $400 billion. Now, what was interesting was to watch all the preliminary scores as we went through the process and all the different stories on preliminary scores, and then to see the final score. The final score is a $400 billion deficit decrease. Now, the way Congressional Budget Office scores is what they call a static score that doesn't take into any economic effects at all. We know, for instance, on the full expensing, every economist, regardless of your political leaning, will say if you do full expensing, that dramatically increases economic activity because people will be incentivized to be able to buy more heavy equipment, which makes them more efficient, all those things. If you do just the static scoring of CBO, $400 billion deficit increase. If you take the Council for Economic Advisors, if you take their score, which is a dynamic score, it is a $4 trillion deficit decrease. So again, it just all the folks pick and choose which scores they want to do. We're looking at the last score when everything was done, when everything was negotiated. It is a deficit reducer, not a deficit increaser.
What was sort of, how would you explain the resistance, some of the resistance to the bill within your own party? We saw some folks in the Senate, some folks in the House. What kind of objections did you have to overcome? We know the Democrats were going to be against it, but what was that? Give us a sense of some of those internal conversation. Was it about the cost? Was it about other issues? Where were people's sticking points?
So let me give you four big ones on that. One is there was a big debate on how much deficit reduction we should do. I was in the camp, quite frankly, of let's do as much as we possibly can and get all the votes for. I don't know how big that is, but we got to be able to find it. We've got a $2 trillion overspending just this year. We got to find a way to be able to turn that down and start turning it down quickly. So there's a lot of argument about how much we could bear as far as deficit reduction. Some of that's an economic argument because you don't want to hurt the economy as you're slowing down the economy. Some of it's just hey, this is something in my state and I don't want to hurt my state on it. So that was a big piece on it. Another big piece had to do with the energy credits. With the IRA passage on it, the Democrats had put in a lot of new energy credits for solar and wind. There was a big argument to say, okay, we don't want to incentivize intermittent power. We want to incentivize base power as much as we can. But also people have made contracts. They've started the process of construction. So there was a big debate of, okay, when do we sunset those out so we don't interrupt contracts that are already in place? That was a big one. And then the two that were the most obvious, Medicaid and SNAP. So let me take both those because you've mentioned both those. SNAP, what some people still call food stamps, that's a program paid entirely by the federal taxpayer, but states actually administer it. Here's what social media got entirely wrong in the changes we made in SNAP. SNAP increases next year. It increases the next year after that. It increases the next year after that. It keeps going up by inflation. Our change in SNAP was because states actually distribute the SNAP benefits. Many states are not careful in how they do it. They don't check eligibility on it. They just give out the SNAP benefits because the federal taxpayer is paying the bill, not the state taxpayer is paying it. So they're not careful when they administer it. Some states are. They're very careful. So what we did is we put in a change on how they can handle SNAP. If a state has what's called an error rate higher than 6%, then the state has to kick in somewhere between 5 to 15% of the amount of money to be able to pay for the whole SNAP program. If you get your error rate down to 6% or lower, the federal taxpayer covers all of it. Well, there's a bunch of folks that freaked out and said states won't do anything. They'll just kick people off of SNAP rather than kick in some additional dollars. I don't think state leaders and legislators across the country are that heartless. I think this incentivizes them to say, okay, let's be more efficient. We've got states like New York and New Jersey and Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. and Georgia and Alaska that have a very high error rate. They just don't check. So we told them, you've got 3 years to get your house in order to be able to get your numbers down to 6 years. For all the other states, they've got 2 years to be able to get their error rates down, to get it down to 6% or less. My state in Oklahoma, by the way, has a 10% error rate. So my state's going to have to get their act together to be able to make sure that they're also reducing their error rate, or my state will have to kick in some of the funds. So that's the biggest change on SNAP. But SNAP continues to grow with inflation, but we're making sure only the people that qualify for SNAP get SNAP. On the Medicaid side, we made two big changes. One of them was we put a work requirement in. SNAP has a work requirement. We basically doubled that work requirement. If you're an able-bodied individual on Medicaid with no children, we believe you should work at least 20 hours a week. You could work 20 hours a week. You could volunteer 20 hours a week. You could be in school or training, but you got to get out there and try and to be able to engage. We require that for SNAP. You don't get food stamp SNAP benefits if you're not actually working or trying to work or training for work or volunteering. Now the same rule is for able-bodied individual for Medicaid. This doesn't apply to the disabled. This doesn't apply to pregnant moms. This applies only to those able-bodied adults that don't have children at home. So that's one big change. The second change is, unlike SNAP, SNAP is paid for by the federal taxpayer. Medicaid is split between the state and the federal. Each one of them gets a portion of the responsibility to pay for Medicaid. Well, over the last 10 years, states have found creative, legal, but creative ways for the state to pay less and the federal taxpayer to be able to pay more. What we just did is we just pushed back on the federal side back to the states and said, nope, we got to balance this back out. You've been finding ways to be able to cut your share less and make federal taxpayers pay more. We have a $2 trillion overspending in the federal side. We need states to be able to step up and to do their share that they agreed to do, that everybody's in contract to do. And we gave them about 10 years to slowly work towards that. So they got a couple of years where there is no change in Medicaid. But then for the next 8 years after that, there's a very slow transition to make sure states are back up to fulfilling their requirement. The federal government is doing their requirement. At the same time, we added a 50 billion with a B, $50 billion fund to help rural hospitals, because rural hospitals are very different than urban and suburban hospitals. Rural hospitals have all the same costs, but they don't have a high patient count. So we want to make sure that in this transition where the states are picking up more, which they're required to do, that the rural hospitals are not hurt in that process. So we added $50 billion to be able to cover the 1,000 rural hospitals around the country to cover their administrative costs and to be able to make sure they're still going to be protected during this. So social media went crazy over it and said people are going to get kicked off Medicaid and people are going to lose SNAP. People just didn't get the facts of what we were actually doing. When I talk to people about it, most people go, well, that makes sense, actually. It's because we think it actually does make sense to do that.
Senator, the $9 billion rescission bill that just passed, barely, seems like a barely seems like a good place to start. But of course, I think a lot of Americans, especially Doge fans, would like to see more. You issue a report called Federal Fumbles, and you've been sort of the OG of Doge in a sense. Where would you like to see rescission bills concentrate their energies next?
Yeah, we've got a lot of places. This is a target-rich environment for rescissions bills. A rescission is very simply, you got 12 appropriation bills that Congress passes, the president signs, it becomes the law that requires the White House to be able to carry that out. If the White House comes in and says, I don't want to spend that money in that place, the White House makes a rescissions request back to Congress and says, allow me to be able to turn this part of the law off. That's what we just took up. That's what we just turned off. It's $9 billion. $8 billion of that was in foreign aid. $1 billion of that was in NPR and PBS to say, okay, those are things we're not going to do anymore, or we're going to do less of to be able to help cover some of those costs. The next area is every area. Look, we can do it in education. We can do it in every single program that's out there, quite frankly, because it's looking for what are we doing that's a nice thing to do, but not required to do. We have a lot of grants. We have a lot of programs that are out there that we say that sounds nice, but we're $2 trillion in overspending, just like every business, just like every family. I'd really like to go out to a super nice restaurant, but we can't afford that right now. So we're going to go to a counter service restaurant, or we're going to go somewhere else to be able to get it, or we're going to cook at home. You make all those hard decisions. We're starting the process of saying, let's start making some hard decisions, what we can do less of. We're still going to do foreign aid. We're still doing refugee work. We're just going to make sure that some of the crazy programs like drivers programs for training for Europeans, why are we paying for that? We shouldn't be paying for that as American taxpayers. So we're turning that off and saying we're not going to do that anymore. So bits and pieces, we're going through the process on it, but this gives us the ability to be very selective in every single program and say, nice to do, but we can't afford it right now.
Do you want to name one thing that you personally would love to see go into a rescission bill next? You have a personal favorite?
I don't know if I'd get a personal favorite right now. Actually, I would start where we started in the foreign aid. I have complained about this for years, that we literally take foreign aid and send it to countries. We rebuilt an ancient fort, is what it was called, in China with our foreign aid money. So literally, we're borrowing money from China to pay for our debt, to then send them money to be able to do a humanitarian historic project in China. That's ridiculous. Why are we doing that? We did projects in Russia just last year that we were doing grant programs to be able to study the effects of COVID on Russian women during the war. Okay, why are we doing this? So I think we started in the right place where most Americans will look at it and say, I understand foreign aid in certain places. I understand aid to Israel. I understand aid that's going to some refugee areas that we're doing our part where other countries are participating. I don't understand doing a COVID study of Russian women while they're attacking the
Senator,
Ukrainians.
do you have any concerns that some of the cuts actually have affected things like refugees? I mean, there's been some reporting out of Africa, Sudan, other places. I mean, does any, obviously you're someone attuned to humanitarian issues and, America's role in the world. I mean, is it really all forts in China? I mean, is there a danger here that we're cutting, cutting things that actually do matter to us as a country and to our values?
So let me say a couple of things with that. One is we literally just did the rescission vote last night. So anything that's happened before this is not connected to that vote. The Trump administration came in and said, we're pausing all foreign aid because there's a lot of crazy foreign aid. So we want to pause all of it until we get a chance to be able to take a look at it. That's where you had a lot of aid organizations say, hey, I appreciate you're looking at other people's stuff, but we're really important. And there were some aid organizations that we are now funding again. The administration has now reopened funding that for months they didn't have funding. And that was a big problem in a lot of places, no question on it. But the administration wanted to pause everything so they got a chance to be able to review it. But the vote that happened last night and then now is going to the House and then will be signed by the president, I'm very confident. Those things have not kicked in yet. It's kind of like Medicaid. We just passed the one big beautiful bill, and I've already had somebody contact me and say, we had a rural hospital that just closed. And I smiled at them and said, that bill doesn't go into effect for 2 years on any of our hospitals. They get 2 years of no changes before anything goes into effect. So if they just closed, it wasn't because of that bill. So that's the challenge of people think it's the government moves faster than it does.
Let me ask you about something that I think was in that rescission bill, and that's the public funding for media, right? For NPR. So you mentioned that this was the right place to start. I mean, does that come from a position that you think the government shouldn't be funding media at all? Do you think, is it a dollar question? I mean, someone might say when you look at our budget, the funding for NPR isn't exactly the biggest line item, in the America. So what's the thinking there, and as a place to start?
Yep, it's $1 billion actually, and $1 billion even at home is a lot of money on that, but it's $1 billion was that reduction. NPR has 90% of their funding comes in from private sources, from sponsorships, all those things. 90% of their funding, 10% of their funding comes from the federal government. For PBS, 85% comes from private donations, 15% comes from the United States government. This goes all the way back decades ago. Ronald Reagan in 1983 proposed taking away the funding, saying, hey, we don't need this anymore. I don't know about you, but when I grew up, I was the remote control when I was growing up. Okay, there was no such thing as a remote control. Mom would say, get up, go change the channel. I would go to the TV and turn the knob. We had 4 channels, ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS. Those are the 4 options that we have. That's not true anymore. The PBS and NPR funding is a relic of decades ago when we had to have some way to be able to get emergency information out, some way to be able to communicate. Now there are thousands of channels. There's thousands of radio options. There's lots of streaming. There's lots of things on people's phones. People don't turn into PBS when they want to see if there's severe weather or an earthquake going on. They're looking at their phones and they're getting immediate information there. So we've got to acknowledge the reality of the times to say that worked decades ago. That is not where we are right now. And if we're looking for different priorities, no one's trying to put PBS out of business or NPR out of business. They're going to survive. They're going to do fine. In fact, we put a 2-year delay in the process for them to give them time to go get more sponsorships to be able to cover that extra 10% they've got to be able to cover and go raise. But there are literally thousands of stations that raise 100%. We believe NPR and PBS can do the same.
I'm old enough to remember those little metal antenna on top of the TV that you had to jigger to get the right signal so you can see those 4 channels. I want to turn to energy. You mentioned it briefly before, but people think Oklahoma and they think oil. But as you said, you have multiple sort of energy projects and industries going on in Oklahoma. One of them is rare earths. You're building you've built a huge magnet plant there, which is used for EVs and for all kinds of future technologies. And really speaks to America's national security, right? Energy security is national security. China leads the world in magnet production, and therefore we are dependent on them for a lot of the technologies that are going to take us into the future. Can you just talk about where you think we are as a country in terms of clawing back some of the production on our side of the world, and how far behind we are, in the race in AI and all of these other industries that are going to require huge amounts of energy?
So we're not behind in AI, but we are behind where we need to be on energy production for AI. AI requires a tremendous amount of energy. And while the nation had kind of plateaued, and for the last decade, we've found ways to be more efficient, switching to LED lights, changing efficiencies, making our homes and businesses more efficient in construction. We didn't increase the amount of power or supply. We just made ourselves more efficient. Now we're at a very efficient spot. We need a lot more energy, though. With AI and all the things that are coming on, our population continues to increase, manufacturing is increasing. We need more power on that. So that's a big issue for us to be able to resolve that. As you mentioned, magnets, very proud of my state in leading the way on trying to be able to get manufacturing for rare earths and for magnet productions. As soon as President Trump put the tariffs on China, the first thing China did was cut off the access to magnets coming into the United States. I don't care if you have a Ford truck or if you're doing a fighter jet, you need magnets. And so it's incredibly important that we have access to that, and China dominates the market right now. We have rare earths in the United States. We're not mining it. We're not processing it. We've got to fix that. We have said for years, we'll let other countries do that and we'll just buy their product. And we're making ourselves progressively more and more and more vulnerable in that. A country that can't produce its own power, its own food, and its own medicine will always be vulnerable. And we are at that spot right now in several of our energy areas with things like magnets, with things like how we're producing lithium and things, batteries for the future and all those things. So we got to catch up. That means harvesting our own rare earths, and it also means processing them right here in the US of A. But that means fixing our permitting process, opening up the opportunities to be able to do that, maybe brownfield sites that are already brownfield sites, moving in some of those processing facilities there. We can do this. We just have to be able to make the decision in a bipartisan way. It's essential for our national security to do it.
Let me shift to foreign policy a little bit. You mentioned aid to Israel before. Obviously, most dramatic thing recently has been the Trump administration's choice to strike around nuclear facilities as part of Israel's 12-day war against Iran. Kind of want your opinion on that. Would also love to know your take on what looks like a pivot on Ukraine policy from the White House. And let me just add a third question, and that's you're hearing a lot from Democrats around this question of is Senate authorization needed for military action, right? There was a lot of kind of kvetching, as we'd say in New York, around, well, Trump didn't ask the Senate. So I'm curious, as in your role as a senator and as someone obviously invested in the institution, on the kind of process front, how you feel about the use of the president's war powers and the process by which lawmakers are involved in American military action.
Yeah, no, I get that and can respect that. I would tell you, those same Democrats that were complaining about President Trump putting an end to Iran's nuclear program didn't complain the same way when President Obama launched 221 Tomahawk missiles at Libya when he was president. So I understand just the political dynamics of that. The president has the authority to be able to defend America and American citizens and American interests for what they sense is something imminent or something important for our national security. But if we're going to war against another country, that has to be something that actually comes through Congress. The president is the commander in chief when the troops are in the field. They don't get a chance to be able to just pick and choose on everything on this, but they do have the ability to be able to say, we're going to defend America. President Trump made a very difficult decision, but I think it was the right call to be able to say Iran was getting closer and closer and closer to having not only nuclear materials, they were enriched at 60% plus of uranium and a very high and fast growing quantity of that highly enriched uranium. But they were also moving closer and closer and closer to the technology to actually detonate that. That's a different threshold on that. And so the president said for years, literally for decades, every American president has said Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. President Trump said Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. He stepped in at that moment. He stopped the bloodshed and the escalating war that was growing between Iran and from Israel to say if the main focus is to end the nuclear program, the United States has the capability to be able to end that right now. For folks that say, well, Americans weren't at risk on that, why did the United States have to act? They lose track of the fact that right now in Israel, over 600,000 Americans are in Israel right now. So yes, there was an imminent attack coming in from Iran on 600,000 plus Americans.
I was one of them reporting from the war. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so that it is something that was affecting America and Americans, not to mention our long-term great relationship with Israel. So it was important to be able to stop the war as fast as possible, to end the nuclear program, and to be able to tell Iran, we have your address. If you try to restart a nuclear program, we know exactly where you are, and we know how to be able to get to you and to be able to stop that. That's very important to be able to give that message to the Ayatollah and all of the leadership there in the IRGC to say you will not, cannot have this nuclear weapons program.
Senator, we only have a minute left, so I just wanted to ask you about religious liberty in America. It's really in your lane. There have been a few court decisions and some other efforts by the administration to redress what some thought were assaults on religious liberty in the prior administration. Can you just talk about where you feel we are as a country on that front and where you feel, I guess, your book is sort of speaking to this? Do you feel there's a revival happening in America right now?
I do. I think a revival in America is not based on an election. My challenge in the book is, hey, don't just vote and walk away. If America culturally, economically, morally, all those things is going to shift, it's not because we vote for a person and they fix it. Washington doesn't change the country changes Washington. And one of the premises I have is, like it or not, Washington, D.C. is a mirror to the country. We're a representative republic. When people look at D.C., that is who we are. And if you don't like it, then what are you going to do about it? It's not just complain about it. Yelling at the TV doesn't fix it. You've got to actually engage in your communities, set the example, to be able to say, quite frankly, be the American you want America to be, and then watch what begins to happen as we shift the country into something that is even more honorable than we already are right now. And to be able to say, we're angry because there are a lot of problems and challenges. So the best thing about anger is not just to be angrier, it's to be able to actually solve the problem. So it's a lot of the premise of the book is to be able to help just nudge us in that way. Religious liberty is a core issue for me. I came out of ministry. I'm very passionate about protecting the rights of every individual to be able to have any faith of their choosing, live that faith, change their faith, or have no faith at all, and to that be protected as an American. And what's rising right now in America is this intolerance to say, if I don't like your faith, you have to silence your faith, or to be able to set that aside, or live your faith over there, but you can't live it out loud near me because it offends me. Well, as Americans, that person's right is protected to be able to have a faith and live their faith, just like a different person's right is to be able to have a faith and to say, I don't live that same faith. That's fine. That's protected, but you can't go silence them. The growing anti-Semitism in our nation as well is exceptionally toxic to everything in our culture. And it's one of the things I continue to be able to call out over and over and over again and challenge this administration to be able to put back in the what's called the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, to say we know what anti-Semitism is. Let's call it, let's label it what it is, and then to be able to call out and be able to speak about it, not just say it's really not. It is. So let's call it out and talk about it as it is. And I think that's better for us as a country to be able to identify it, label it, and then to be able to do what we can as a culture to say that's not who we are.
Senator Lankford, thank you so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure. Hope to talk to you again.
Absolutely my pleasure to be able to visit. I look forward to getting a chance to be able to visit and hopefully face-to-face in the days ahead to be able to catch up.
Thanks again.
Take care.